I'm going to tell you something about tapping into American generosity, an introduction for foreign cultural institutions. And I know that some of you are actually from the US, so I hope I'm not going to bore you with my story. I still hope that you'll get... No? I think I put it on, though. I don't think there's much I can do on my side. Is that better? Okay. Well, let me try to move it up. Does that sound better? I can hold it, actually. Yeah. Yeah, I can hold it, that's all right. So basically, what I was saying is that it's about tapping into American generosity, an introduction for foreign cultural organizations, and I realize that some of you are actually from the US, so I hope it still will be something useful for our American friends as well, actually. And I'll start my brief presentation with there you go. Telling you a bit about how I, with my European background, actually look at American cultural institutions. I'll give you a few figures on giving in the United States. I'll tell you a little bit about the American fundraising model, not too much because we have some great fundraisers here. I'm looking at Amanda, I'm looking at John in the room, so if I go too much in depth I might say stupid things. So Amanda and John, please correct me if I'm going that route actually. And after that I'll tell you something about the legal structures in terms of fundraising as a foreign institutions, what are the options that you have to raise monies in the US, and I'll touch a word upon what King Baudouin Foundation United States, which is the organization I represent and I'm leading here in New York, can signify for you. Now, starting at what I like to call the target funding sources for an average US cultural institutions. Now, there's nothing like an average US cultural institution. I think that's the first comment to start, that obviously every institution is a different animal, if I may say. And it's also a target, meaning quite a few American institutions, you know, have different revenue streams. But from what I understand from various sources, is truly that a typical museum director in the US would love to have a budget like that. And a budget like that, basically funding sources like that, that means 10% revenue from public authorities. A lot of museums in the US have actually quite less. If you look at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, if you look at the Whitney Museum in New York, they typically receive less funding from public authorities. There's also exceptions. If you take the Smithsonian museums, that typically receive much more from the public authorities. What you'll notice as well is a small third that is coming from fundraising, actually gifts received during the course of the year. You'll also see 30% revenue from an endowment, which is part here, the orange part, and that's a strong drive in recent years from American cultural institutions to actually build those kind of endowments so that year after year they would not have to do the fundraising. That model, which is obviously very different from one I know better, and that's the European model actually of how do you fund the cultural institutions, has strong consequences. And one of the consequences is obviously that you have a board that is much more independent than in a European context. It's a board that is usually composed of wealthy individuals, and the board members are typically also your main donors. You don't have representatives typically of cultural institutions. I think I can put it back there. Does it work like that? Okay, thank you. You don't have representatives of public authorities within your board. In European context, you have a lot of ministries of culture and they have representatives on your board. You wouldn't typically see that in an American context. You have the board that actually also hires and fires the CEO of the museum, which is not what we see in most foreign organizations. I don't know. Let me wait for Natascha. But anyway, you'll see actually a model in the US as well where organizations can go bankrupt, which is a very different thing. It's something that is kind of unheard of in a European context. I don't know if you know the New York City the New York City Opera, which you may know, or which you may have known, but ultimately went bankrupt because they didn't receive enough funding from their major donors, actually. So it's basically, the point I'm trying to make is that the funding sources in the US for typical US cultural institutions are very different than certainly in Europe and probably also in Asia and Latin America. And that difference in terms of funding has a strong consequence on the way organizations are run, including with the board. Moving forward, looking at giving in the US, two brief slides over there, which give you a perspective both in terms of the amounts. You'll see that total contributions in 2016 in the US amounted to $390 billion, so quite an amount actually. You'll see, I think that's probably the key message of this, is that 72% of the contributions given in 2016 came from individuals. And if you add to that the 8% in terms of bequests, which are basically legacies, individuals leaving monies to institutions, to non-profit organizations through a last will and testament, that brings you to 80%. I think that's an important message, especially for foreign organizations where there is a strong tendency, at least in Europe, but I would suspect in other parts of the world as well, to turn to corporations for sponsoring. And especially cultural institutions, museums, they would go to their local bank, to their local insurance company, to have some monies to support a specific exhibition, which is all fine. But the lesson that we learn from the US is truly individuals. That is where the monies truly are. That is where basically the future lies in terms of fundraising. Now, in terms of where do the monies go, the monies go in the US to a full range of issue areas. You'll see that you get 15% for education that is given. You'll see that arts, culture, and humanities actually represent 5% of total giving. So that's 5% of that total pie of $390 billion. You'll see that if you were running a church, you would actually have a much better chance of success in the United States, at least in terms of fundraising, than in terms of running an iconic house. But ultimately, taken together, the 5% of the $390 billion is not so bad. Now, a word on the American fundraising model, which I believe is important as well, especially at foreign organizations. If you're a foreign museum, a foreign iconic house, you want to raise monies in the US, obviously you need to know how the locals behave and how they do it. And again, I'll talk about it in a nutshell without too much details, because I know that with Amanda and John, you touched on some of those points already. The need for strategic planning, the first point you'll see on that slide, is a key aspect. Overseas, especially in Europe, there is still too much of a tendency to say, well, I have that great museum, I need some monies, I will hire a director of development, a director of fundraising, and that will be the job of that person. They will be basically working in a vacuum, and the expectation from the cultural institution is that the director of fundraising is going to solve the full problem. Well, that's not the way it works. It's not the way it works in Europe. It's certainly not the way it works in the US. Basically, their strategic planning means that it's not something that you do on the side, the fundraising. It really should be of a broader strategic plan for your organization. What makes you so special? It seems to make sense to reflect on, well, who you are and what are you going to sell to those donors. Well, again, I think it's something where too often there is a bit of a shortcut overseas. You need to reflect on that. New York State, New York University, NYU, for example, when they relaunched huge fundraising campaigns in the 70s, they thought about what made them different from a Columbia University, which is the other major university in New York City. And they decided basically to profile themselves, both in terms of messaging, but also in terms of the real content, as the university that is within the city. Where if you have an interest in Broadway, you can study at New York University, but you will also get an internship on Broadway. If you have an interest in finance, they'll make the link to Wall Street for you. Whereas Columbia University is more uptown, is closed off by a wall, sometimes a virtual wall. It's a very different structure. So basically profiling you yourselves, what makes you special, what makes you different, and sometimes that portraying of what are you, what do you stand for, what makes you special, also needs to be adapted from target audience to target audience. We work closely at the King Baudouin Foundation US with Institut Curie in Paris, France. They work on cancer research, you probably know it. So very different, obviously, from the iconic houses. But the message there is that when they do their fundraising in France, in Paris, they're going to talk about being the leading cancer research institute in the country. And that message doesn't work in the US. When they arrived to the US, they said, well, we're going to raise monies here as, you know, the leading cancer research organization in France. And obviously no one really cares, because the best cancer research that you can dream of is in the United States. So they rebranded their name, and they rethought about how to profile themselves. And they went back to the story of Madame Curie, which is a beautiful story. Madame Curie, after which the institute is named, and who actually raised the first monies to do the research from American women. And that's the way that they basically adapted the way that they present themselves to a target audience that is here in the US. Fundraising is everybody's job, and we forget that. We forget that in a European context, again, with my apologies for our friends from Asia and from Latin America, but I think that you can relate to that message as well. And it starts with the board of directors, the board of trustees. There's a saying in New York, or probably all across the US, it's the rule of the 3 Gs. And the 3 Gs, they stand for give, get, or get off my board. And basically that says the message is the board members are expected to contribute. Not only expertise, not only networks, but also financially. And you know that if you join the board of the Metropolitan Opera, that is going to cost you $250,000 a year. That's a reality, and people know that. And if you can't give because you don't necessarily have the monies, you know, you can get some other people to give. Maybe you have other networks. And if you don't have that either, well, there's a strong likelihood that you'll get off my board. That's the reality. It may sound a bit crass, but ultimately you can't blame it on the institution if you think back on the way that they are funded and their dependence on fundraising and building endowments, actually. The chief executive officer, again, I think that's crucial. Overseas, too many museum directors, too many directors of cultural organizations, they don't feel that fundraising and networking with donors is part of what they should do and is part of their job description. They think that's the job of the development director. But ultimately, donors want to meet the person who has the vision for the organization, the person who's in charge. And yes, the chief development officer, the chief fundraiser, has a role to play in coordinating the research, in making sure that you have your communications programs together, making sure that, you know, in terms of major gift fundraising, in terms of planned giving, in terms of all of those tools, you have basically the structures in place. But ultimately, in terms of when it's time to ask for monies, and especially when you're talking about larger donors, the CEO has a key role to play. Just like the chief curator, you might say, well, what's the link between a chief curator and fundraising? Well, that's where the passion is and the technicalities of it. You know, when you want to give to a museum where they have beautiful paintings, some of the donors might be interested in, well, how do you restore? How do you maintain properties like that? How do you make sure that they continue to live for generations to come? And that's the job of the chief curator, basically, who puts together the exhibition, but who also has an important role to play in terms of the preservation of all of those treasures. The last aspect of the American fundraising model that I would like to highlight is that there's a full process behind it. Actually, should have started with that quote from Naomi Levine, who's the former senior vice president for development at New York University, who typically says that, well, reviving New York University, developing successful fundraising campaign, well, it didn't happen by a miracle. It happened by a process, and it happened by principles that we followed. And part of those principles is make sure that indeed for the various steps from prospect identification to membership programs to the major gifts, to planned giving, the special events and all of that, that all of those things make sense and work together towards the broader goal. And the broader goal is to make sure that you are a thriving organization with a strong and diverse donor base. Understanding why people give, again, with foreign eyes, there's too quickly the tendency to say that, yes, Americans are generous, Americans contribute to museums, other institutions, the university, because they get a tax break. And it might be true that they get a tax break, but I also say that overseas, when you look at the tax regimes in most European countries, the tax break you get is actually much more generous than in the US, just because you basically pay more taxes. That's the reality. So for most donors, the ones who contribute $100 to, let's say, $10,000 a year, they will be much better off in a country like France or Belgium or Germany or the Netherlands in terms of what is the cost of the $1,000 they send in. If you can deduct it from your taxes, you're going to be better off overseas than in the US. So that's not the real reason. The real reason, and you see a full range of reasons there. Someone mentioned to me the mass. I don't know if it rings a bell with Amanda or not, and I don't know if you're going to agree with that, but basically the various reasons people give can be combined in four classes, if I may say. The first one is the mission. People give to you because they love the mission, because they love architecture, they love modernism, they love the kind of job you have at trying to preserve those beautiful structures for the new generations. So those are people who are totally driven by your mission. You don't really need to build social programs for them. You need to convince them that you're good at your job and that that house will remain open in the perfect shape for the next 25 years. So that's really the people, the donor, who are driven by the mission. There's people who are driven by access. And those are donors who would be interested in joining your board because they'll meet other people. They'll meet other people that I can do business with. They'll meet other people that they enjoy in a social context, and that basically that aspect of providing access to the networks is an important aspect. A third category that I have here are people driven by the social aspect. And social aspect, the way I mean that, is really people who actually love to join you for a Sunday brunch at a house, who love to participate in a concert in an iconic house, who love basically to be part, not necessarily of the power aspect of the network, but really spending time together with others that share a passion. And then there's people who are driven by the status aspect, because it looks good. If you're on the board of the Museum of Modern Art, it is something that basically gives you some cachet, especially in a city like New York. Now, I started this slide by telling you that the tax aspect is not the main driver to give, and I still believe that, even if I'm going to talk about this slide. But you'll see that basically in the US there is a system in terms of tax deduction that is quite sophisticated. For gifts of cash, donors can deduct up to 60% of their adjusted gross income, which is really kind of a high floor when you compare to what is allowed in a country like France or Belgium. In addition, if you end up giving away more than 60% of your adjusted gross income, you have a possibility to carry that over. Whatever you have not deducted in the year of your contribution, you have 5 years to basically deduct it in the future. up to the total amount of your gift, obviously. There are special rules for gifts of publicly traded securities. You can also give life insurance policies, retirement plan assets. In terms of bequest, there's an estate tax deduction for the entire amount of the gift. Gifts of artwork are interesting potentially for you as well, because artworks is defined in a broader context, so it can be furniture, it can be archives, it can be libraries, and in most cases there is a possibility for the donor to deduct the full fair market value of the artwork, but only, and that's important, if the gift of that artwork is actually used by the beneficiary organization for a purpose that relates to the mission of the organization for at least 3 years. Now, talking about raising funds in the US, what are the legal options that you have as a foreign institution if you would like to raise monies in this country? So it's a much more technical aspect. It's much less romantic than talking about the actual art of fundraising. But there's basically 2 possibilities that you have if you want to raise monies here. Because obviously the donors whom you will talk to will ask you what kind of structure you have in place in the US. In the US, they call that the US public charity, a 501c3 public charity, and that is basically the first option you have, is basically creating your own 501c3 public charity. That is the way that the University of Oxford is raising monies here, that the Museum of the Louvre or the British Museum or Cambridge University, a full range of other top-level organizations are raising monies here. They have their own public charity. You have a full process, and if you get a copy of this presentation, if you click on all those web links, it will bring you actually to the forms and the resources from the Internal Revenue Service, which is the tax authorities in the US, and that will provide you with guidance on how do you do that, setting up your own 501c3 public charity. It's 4 steps. You'll see it there. You create your own organization. You register at the state level for charitable solicitation purposes. You apply for the tax-exempt status with the US tax authorities, and after that you have some filings that you need to do on an annual basis, the annual tax return, which is the Form 990, and ongoing compliance. And I would say that that's the way you really should do it, setting up your own 501c3 public charity. If what you want to have is your own office in the United States, with your own staff on the payroll, then that's the way to do it, just like Oxford and Cambridge and the Louvre. But if you do not intend to have such a physical office with staff, what I would suggest is to go for an option which is a later version actually, and that is partnering with a fiscal sponsor. And partnering with the fiscal sponsor, basically, you don't need to incorporate, you don't need to apply for federal tax exemption, you don't need to have a board and formal board meetings and all that. You don't need to worry about the annual audit. There's no worries about the annual tax return that you need to file. And basically you will find a fiscal sponsor that takes care of the full back office infrastructure as well, meaning the donor support, receiving of the checks, credit card donations, and all of those practical aspects that are associated with raising monies in this country. That's the kind of services that we provide with the King Baudouin Foundation US, but there's also a full range of others that provide similar services. And that's where the question comes in, saying, well, let's say that you would like to raise monies in the US, that you truly believe that you have a strong point and that you have potential donors who love what you do and would like to be generous with your organization. you need to find one that obviously has the right fit with your geographic focus. I mentioned before that, yes, indeed, with the King Baudouin Foundation US, we facilitate giving all across Europe, all across Africa. For our Asian friends, there's an organization called Give to Asia. Their website is give and then figure 2 asia.org. They basically facilitate giving from the US to nonprofits all across Asia, and they also act as the fiscal sponsor to Asian nonprofit organizations. And I know that we have some Latin American friends in the room as well. For them, there is an organization that is called the Resource Foundation. If you Google the Resource Foundation based in New York City, you will find their contact information, and they also have fiscal sponsorship solutions for Latin American nonprofit organizations. But there's also others. There's an organization in DC called CAF America. There's another one called United Way Worldwide. There is TIDES. So all of those organizations provide those fiscal sponsorship services. Now, if you would like to know what we do with the King Baudouin Foundation US in terms of the solutions we provide, and basically the background on who we are, basically we established our offices in '97. We're based in New York City as a 501c3. Our mission here is really to facilitate thoughtful, effective giving to Europe and Africa. So we work with American donors and help them support their favorite nonprofits overseas, and we have those fiscal sponsorship solutions for European and African nonprofits that try to raise monies in the US. And we have some education programs as well. We affiliated with the King Baudouin Foundation based in Brussels, Belgium. And last year we had total revenues about $23 million that all obviously went to great causes or overseas in Europe and Africa. 3 solutions we have for European and African nonprofits. The first one is called the American Friends Funds, and that's the fiscal sponsorship solution that I was talking about. It's basically easy to set up. It's a cost-effective solution for European and African nonprofits seeking to raise funds in the US. So if you have an iconic house based on one of those 2 continents, we can help you, and we can save you the trouble of setting up your own 501c3 in the US. And that will provide you with a tool basically to receive fully tax-deductible donations and tax-deductible for US tax purposes as well. In addition to taking care of all of the tax and the legal issues, there's also obviously the back office that we take care of, online donations by credit card, donations by check, donations by appreciated stock, and all of that. Again, you'll find more info either by talking to me or by clicking on the web link there. More info, you'll get to our website, and you'll see a brief list there of some of the 300 partners that we already partner with. And some of them are what I would call big iconic houses. You'll see the Château de Chambord, for example. It's not the smallest one. I don't really know if Natascha will still consider that an iconic house or not. It's certainly, I'm talking about the Château de Chambord, which used to be a private home. There you go. There you. So it would not qualify for membership of iconic houses. It's still a gorgeous residence, I would say. I wouldn't mind. But you'll see as well that iconic houses itself in the Netherlands actually is partnering with the King Baudouin Foundation US for their fundraising, targeting donors in the US. Now, quickly, 2 other things that you may have an interest in. We launched a couple of years ago a new initiative called KBFUS Art, which I'm quite happy about, which is getting traction, and which is an initiative by which we receive donations of artworks from US donors for cultural institutions, again, with a focus on Europe, with a focus on Africa. But again, some of our partners can help you out if you're based in Asia or Latin America. So you'll see some of the examples that we received. We received some great photographs for the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. We received some French artworks for the Petit Palais in France. A painting by Luc Termans for the Athenaeum in Antwerp. So again, it's a broad definition of artwork: archives, drawings, libraries, whatever has a certain value, because ultimately you're talking here about tax deduction in a US context, and whatever has a cultural value from your perspective and would add obviously to your mission, we can help you with that. And then lastly, and that's the way I'm going to close, is that each year we organize a 4-day study visit on the art and science of fundraising, again focused either on European organizations or on African organizations, because we have 2 of those programs. It's a great way to learn more about how US organizations conduct their fundraising, about what especially New York institutions, how they develop interesting approaches to that subject. The next programs will take place in April and May 2019. And that's the way I would like to conclude that presentation. You'll find my contact information and the contact information of my colleagues on the last slide, actually. With my thanks. Any thoughts, any questions?
I have a question. Could you tell a little bit more about that archive situation that you just showed, the archive of Italian artists that were now given to the museum?
The archives, okay, yeah.
How does that work?
You're based in Italy, you're Italian.
I'm based in an archive.
In an archive, okay. Sure. Sure. Well, I'll be brief on that, but basically that case, and it's public information, so I can tell you about the name of the donor. It's a gentleman whose name is Everett Fahy. He actually passed away just a week or 2 ago, who used to be the director of the Frick Collection in New York, and then moved on to become a curator at the Metropolitan Museum. His passion was Italian Renaissance artists, and he had a huge archive. Not in the way that perhaps you thought about it, an archives on one specific house or one specific project or something like that. It was basically an archive that comprises thousands and thousands of pictures and research material on Italian Renaissance artists. Correct. And basically he wanted that archive to end up at Fondazione Federico Zeri, which is an archive management organization which is part of the University of Bologna. And we facilitated that. Basically, we received a contribution from Dr. Everett Fahy. It was tax deductible in the US for US tax purposes. Before that, it was reviewed by what we call an art advisory committee that basically advises us on, well, what has a cultural value, does it make sense to receive it as an institution, and then to put it on loan, because the way we basically satisfy that rule that I mentioned, that for the donation of an archive or an artwork to be tax deductible in the US, the beneficiary organization, meaning King Baudouin Foundation US, needs to use it for at least 3 years for related purposes. And the way we do that for all those examples is that we first put it on loan for 3 years, in this context to the University of Bologna. So they basically can use it from day one, and after 3-4 years, our board can indeed give the full property of that archive or that artwork to the museum overseas. So it's a bit more technical than cash donations, but it works well, and it adds a different dimension to the job, if I may say.
So does that archive have to be in the US and then go somewhere else? Or like at somewhere else, but it can be in Europe and go to European museum?
Yeah. Well, Ed van der Elsken was actually in the US. It was part of the collection of a Dutch gentleman uh, based in Los Angeles, part of the Hollywood scene and the film industry and all that. So he was a collector, decided to give it to the Rijksmuseum and basically structured that as a gift to the King Baudouin Foundation US, first put on loan to the Rijksmuseum with the possibility of, after that, giving away the full property. It only makes sense because if you're talking about the Dutch collector who wants to give to the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands, there's no reason for them to work with us, obviously. You always, look at the quickest roads. As long, obviously, as you know, the Parent Foundation in Brussels plays another role in terms of archives and in terms of donations of artwork. They basically receive artworks, put it on loan with the local museums, but they keep playing a role of a de facto trustee, meaning especially later in life, if donors that have artworks would like to give them to a museum, because they know the museum director, but they don't really know who's going to be the museum director in 20, 30 years. So they like the idea of working with a third party like the King Baudouin Foundation, who can keep an eye open on the longer run and make sure that the museum or the other cultural institutions continues to use that artwork, that it doesn't disappear, in the archives actually of the museum. So we play that kind of role with our parent foundation of a de facto trustee.
Thank you.
Further question?
Is there a reverse interest? Do you facilitate European or international donors? Given
We do. We do in certain cases. We work with some universities, especially those, I think it's University of Chicago, and I believe another one that have a strong alumni base in the US. The challenge with the European situation is the complexity of it, because ultimately we all think, from a US perspective that, well, it's a European donor. Well, Europe doesn't really exist certainly not when you talk about taxes. Those are still national issues, meaning if you have a French donor, you need to have a French solution or a French partner if you have a Belgian donor. So there is a complicated process, but it works, where you can indeed work with an organization like our Brussels office, set up a European Friends of whatever organization you are representing, and then use a network called Transnational Giving Europe Network, which you may have heard about. And Transnational Giving Europe Network is basically, there's one main partner in each country. It's the King Baudouin Foundation in Brussels, it's the Fondation de France in France. And for each major country in Europe, you have that. And you use that fund that you set up at the King Baudouin Foundation Brussels as your European base, and then work with the full network of European foundations to basically pool those resources at King Baudouin Foundation Brussels before transferring them to the US. So it's a bit more technical due to the complexity of the European tax situation. No more questions?
No.
I think we're done, Natascha.
Oh, here.
Yes.
Not a question, just to say how important is what you all said, you three said, about fundraising is more people than about people. And we had a very tragic example of that in the Chillida Museum or Chillida Foundation in San Sebastián in Spain that lived only from the money from the government, Spanish government, and that was very, very bad a few years ago and had to close. And the Chillida space, the Eduardo Chillida's, the most important past artist, and the family was only helped by the government and didn't have
The donor base.
campaign or a donors program, and closed. And these are the tragedies that
Yeah.
we have to really look, because many of our house museums are
But I think it's an important comment because basically earlier you may remember that I mentioned that obviously the way most US cultural institutions are funded has consequences on the way organizations are run. And I mentioned one of the consequences is that actually cultural institutions go bankrupt in the US, mentioning the New York City Opera. And I assume that in Europe it would be much less the case because you have the public authorities that are in charge and that are not going to let you go. But you bring to the table an interesting example of an actual real example of an organization that had to close its door despite the fact that it was fully funded by public authorities. I think like in many things it's a question of balance, and you don't want to be vulnerable to one specific source, whatever that source is. You don't want to be vulnerable to one Ministry of Culture that might fund you, meaning the public authorities. You don't also want to be dependent on one single donor, because if something happens and the donor, doesn't like the way an organization is run, you might get into big trouble there as well. So I think it's more kind of underlining the importance of diversification of different sources. And that relates to that first slide that you may remember that I showed you, where indeed organizations try to set up endowments that will bring annual revenue to cover some of the expenses. And then there's obviously the donations received in a calendar year. And then there's the tickets aspect and the rental of the venue. And when you bring it all together, it makes you stronger because you're less dependent on one single source. Yes?
Yeah, perfectly on time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natascha.